Well, just a couple of weeks ago, the federal government reached a settlement with Canada's First Nations and their families for harm done to thousands of children through the child welfare system. The $23 billion settlement follows a Human Rights Tribunal award of $40,000 each for child, parent, or caregivers affected by the systemic bias in the system. It was negotiated by the Assembly of First Nations and the BC First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Cindy Woodhouse is Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nations in Manitoba. Thank you for being with us, Chief.
Thanks for having me.
So I did want to start with that settlement and what it represents. Obviously it's a recognition of past harms, but it isn't everything in the sense that the big issue here was making sure the harms don't continue. So can you put it into context for us?
Well, it's a settlement agreement with the federal government on child welfare. It's a form of reconciliation, a very important one, because it deals with individual human rights violations dating back to, we know that it's longer than that, but 1991 onward for many children in the child welfare system that were funded through the First Nations Child and Family Services program. And a lot of these families have been harmed, and it's been like that since I'll say.
It highlights something, of course, that is still true in many ways, and that is that there's different treatment for Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And that's true in spending on healthcare, education, and in the welfare system, and the child and family welfare system being one example. Have we narrowed the gap? Are we doing what needs to happen to actually equalize so that there isn't an unfair treatment systemically in the system?
Well, we have a long way to go. I know that this government has been pushing, and I'm glad for that we've had partnerships since 2015 on closing the gap. And I know that we're pushing towards closing the gap to 2030. And we have to keep working at that. I know that we have a long way to go, but there's been so much neglect over successive governments that, it's taken longer than expected. It's going to take a long time to close that gap.
Mm-hmm. And so today, there will still be children and families who are dealt with through Child and Family Services through that system. Is it better? Have we solved some of the issues that have been so harmful?
Well, I think in Manitoba here, unfortunately this morning, I seen a video once again of a child being apprehended in a Winnipeg hospital and being taken from their mother. And it's very alarming to see that this is still happening when we're trying to work through reforming a really broken system. And so those policies, those things have to stop, first and foremost. And it's been like that, right? Since residential school, it's always been about our children. Mm-hmm. Residential schools, day schools, the 60s scoop, and now unfortunately the child welfare system, where our people are overrepresented in that system. And we really need to stop the bleeding, and we need to keep our families together and have governments back off with their policies of, you need 5 bedrooms in order to have 5 children, and it's very disheartening to see that again this morning.
Yeah, couldn't have grown up in my house with that rule. Obviously, the settlement is one thing. Money is one thing, Chief. But what does need to happen to make sure that those kinds of policies really change?
Well, I think we have to take a First Nations-led approach. I think that provincial governments, although they're very reluctant, I'm glad that there's some traction since 5 years ago when we had first talked about this issue and reforming the system 5 years back, that there's at least a little bit more, it seems like more leeway from provinces across the country to start working with First Nations. But we have a lot of work to do because it's been this way for far too long. And I think that we have a lot of work to do together, and we all need each other. And it's not about excluding anybody else, but we do need to, put the rights back. We've always had our rights. We've never given up the rights to our children. And we need to make sure that we put our families back together once again.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Cindy Woodhouse is the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief in Manitoba. Time for the takeaway and the hard thing about solving hard problems. When it comes to Canada's Indigenous peoples and the relationship and potential that exists, no one is served by oversimplification, as tempting as that may be. These days, it's the norm that most big issues and small ones are reduced to black and white, sound bite-sized stories. The size and potential of the Indigenous economy can't really be viewed in a vacuum. There's no separating its fortunes from that of the province or country as a whole, and it works both ways. Perhaps even harder, there's no way to see the massive potential that exists for this population without acknowledging the complexity. The potential is clear for Indigenous populations. It is young, it is fast-growing, and it could benefit from a massive leverage effect of simply equalized access to healthcare, education, and jobs. It would be easy to try to spin this story as all upside, but that story only exists in the larger context of history and systemic realities that make realizing it that much harder. In the same way, while there may be some First Nations who sign on to natural resource projects, there are others which vehemently oppose them. Talking about Indigenous peoples as though they're one group or even several is to miss a pretty important and complex reality. But having the right conversations is the only way to get where we need to go. Even the UN data show that life on reserve makes for worse outcomes than life for Indigenous people off reserve. Does that mean reserves are bad? Hardly a conclusion that will serve anyone well, but it's important information all the same. Recognizing how thorny the issue is may be the only way to get to the root of a problem without causing harm. My takeaway? Canada and its Indigenous people have a road to walk, and we can definitely find our way to the right place. But blind optimism and ignoring hard truths is never a good guide. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.